Thinking Out Loud with Dave Palmer. Here on Morning Joy, where truth matters.
Welcome back to Morning Joy, where truth matters. I'm your host, Keith Downey. And is there anything out there in this world that can satisfy us ultimately? Probably not, but we'll find out the correct answer here with Dave Palmer on Thinking Out Loud. Good morning, Dave.
Good morning, Keith. Well, if you want to make this a really short segment, I'll just say the answer is no, okay?
Okay.
We'll move on to the next segment, okay? If you want a little more information, we could do that as well, okay? Which one?
Let's go ahead and dive deeper into it.
All right. I thought of this topic for a couple of reasons, and I love that Adam and Debbie were talking about the sacraments, because obviously with sanctifying grace, that's going to direct us to our final end, and that was such an interesting segment that they had there. But first of all, we've been journeying through the Summa, and this is the logical next, section of the Summa. We learned about God, and He is our beatitude, and He's our happiness and our final end, and all that. So then, as you start the what's called prima secunda, the next part of the Summa, it's specifically about this topic. It's like, what makes man happy? And woman happy, of course. And I also think that this season, especially, what a week ago, what we were going through with the election cycle, and many of us, ended that day really, really happy. But then 4 years ago, the people who were happy a week ago were unhappy, and 8 years ago we were happy. And, it's this cyclical nature of up and down and up and down. And also, I live in North Texas, and I don't know if you've noticed, but our sports teams are not doing all that well, So the Cowboys, came into the season with such high expectations. And I don't know anybody that says, sports are my final end. They never say that. But sometimes people live kind of like that, where, their emotions really ride high and low according to sports. And we know that is really, really ephemeral and really comes and goes. And so anyways, I want to talk about that, what ultimately makes us happy. And I think people are probably thinking, well, we know it's God and, that kind of thing. And that is the right answer. But Thomas digs in a little deeper and maybe explains it in a way that might help us from a practical sense day to day, kind of realize that the things that we're maybe getting worked up about are not worthy of that much of our emotion and our time. So the first, lesson is that, we were created for happiness. Aristotle said that. Okay, so and also our will desires happiness of necessity. Okay, so you don't have the free will to not want to be happy. So that's one interesting concept is, people like, then I don't have free will. Well, you do, but you have free will in regard to the things you're going to choose to get to that happiness. Okay, that's where free will is, but you can't not want to be happy. And I think everybody can understand that. Everything we do is towards happiness. And there is another interesting article in the Summa where St. Thomas says, is everything that we will, is every single thing that we do directed towards our final end? And he says, yeah. Ultimately, everything is either that final end, like the Eucharist, is God, is Jesus Christ. That's our final end. Or it's tending towards that final end. Like Adam was talking about, listening to the Bible. That's something that's really conducive to our final end, right? But listening to the Bible is not our final end. It's getting us to there. So that's the first principle. We all want to be happy of necessity. And so we got to keep that in mind. And then I think the second thing from a practical sense to keep in mind is the makeup of the human person. All right. You kind of take an inventory every day of like, okay, I've got intellect, I've got will, I've got these passions that sometimes can get a little out of control. I have appetites, I want food and sleep, and I've got these desires and intellectual appetites, which is the will. And so we're an interesting, complex creature, right? So the intellect naturally seeks the universal true. All right, that's the object of the intellect is truth, the universal truth, which of course is God. The will naturally seeks the universal good, and so the intellectual appetite of the will seeks the universal good, and so we were hardwired to desire God. But again, then we are hardwired to desire happiness out of necessity. But that's where the complication comes. And I'll take a little pause here to take a sip of coffee and see if you have any follow-up questions. But and what I'll talk about next is that the complicating thing is that, of course, we have original sin and concupiscence, and we are surrounded every day, every moment with like tons of really good things that are directed towards our end, but aren't our end. And the temptation is to make those our end. All right. So that's the setup.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And you may go into this a little bit further, but when you were talking about how we seek happiness and then we seek truth, and how often, especially today, how that gets so distorted because, you know, we may find, you know, physical objects like, oh, that new iPhone, that if I get this, it's going to make me so much more happier because it does this and this, or this is what I believe to be true, and it may not actually be true at all. So it's interesting how, like, we do seek these things, but we're often misguided. And I think a lot has to do with the fact that we just, at least in this age, we've removed God from a lot of aspects of our life.
Yeah, and the iPhone's a great example because what Aquinas is going to say, of course, he never mentioned the iPhone for some reason in the Summa, but is what he's going to say is, think about the iPhone. You don't get an iPhone as an end itself. You want an iPhone primarily to keep in touch with the world and keep in touch with friends, right? So the iPhone is a means to an end. You know, it doesn't, in and of itself, it doesn't make you happy, but it's what it is able to do for you is that, you know, wow, I can send Keith a text after the show today with my iPhone, right? And because I like Keith, or I like Tim, or I like my wife. I actually like my wife more than I like you guys, right? So Thomas, he talks about wealth. Okay, so there's something called natural wealth, and that's like food and drink and sleep, right? And he says even those are for the body, and the body is for the soul. So those things are not an end to themselves. Then there's artificial wealth, and that's money. And with money, you even go a layer deeper, because money in and of itself is nothing to us. It's only the things that we get with money, right? We get the natural wealth, we get the food, we get the drink, you know, we get the shelter, or whatever we want. So you got to keep going layers back about like how far back are these things from my ultimate happiness. Another one is interesting. Like a lot of us like honors. We like to get awards, or we like to get recognition, but the honors are for something that we did, you know, so the honors are not in and of themselves anything. Or take power, for example. Nobody cares about power unless the power allows you to do something else, right? You know, I want the power so in order to achieve my goals. And so you see that it's kind of like a stair step, and all these lower goods and everything I mentioned is good, are ultimately pointing us to the ultimate good. And I think if we can see all that in context, like, you know, sports, for example, well, hey, I like to sit around with my kids or my spouse and watch a Cowboy game, or a whatever game, the Cardinal game in your case, right? That's right. Hey, that's a good thing. But if you're like emotionally involved 10 seconds after the game, and you're like, you know, throwing furniture around the house, not that you would do that, Keith, but there'd be a problem, right? And so anyway, so the end thing is that no created good can ever make us happy, because we're always seeking something else. You know, it's never an end to itself. And so what is our ultimate happiness? St. Thomas describes it as a vision of the divine essence. Okay, a vision of the divine essence is the final good. It's what we ultimately desire. And then it's kind of humbling, because we realize, well, you know what? We can't achieve that on our own. It requires God's grace. It requires him helping us to get there. And so the very thing that we should set our final end at, we can't get on our own. And so that creates a little bit of humility in us, and also a dependence on God to be ultimately happy. So hopefully that helps a little bit for those who are listening today.
Yeah, absolutely. And Debbie and Adam were previously talking about, do we take the sacraments seriously? Would you say that, because obviously nothing of this world can ultimately satisfy us, would you say the sacraments could be one aspect that could satisfy us, at least until we're in heaven, hopefully?
Yeah, I mean, the sacraments have a hierarchy, right? Like the Eucharist is God Himself, right? It is so that's the greatest of the sacraments, and something like baptism that that Adam and Debbie were talking about that provides us with the sanctifying grace and ontologically changes us. Well, even that is something we receive towards an end, right? Baptism is not our end, because otherwise, after we were baptized, we would just be done, right? But we still have to live this life and all that. Marriage, of course, is a sacrament, but we all know it's not an end to itself, because after we receive that sanctifying grace in marriage, there's up and downs and confirmation and every single one of them. Confession, we know we go to confession, and then 2 weeks later we need to go to confession again, even though we got that sanctifying grace of absolution. So even the sacraments, other than the Eucharist, are only pointing us and getting us to that final end. But they certainly are a huge, huge help getting us there.
Yeah. Wow. So good. Well, I can't thank you enough for joining us once again, Dave, talking about the Summa. It's so great to be going through it every single week, every Tuesday here. But we can also catch you on Back to the Father, Fridays at 1 p.m. Central on GRN Online YouTube. And last Friday, you talked an interesting aspect, Thomism meets the election. And then I liked how you asked the question, what can we actually agree upon? Like, there's a lot of division, but what do we actually agree upon? You asked some very good questions and added some elements as well as to what we agree upon. Like, I think you said education. Every child should have an education. So it was really good stuff. I recommend, if anybody did not catch last Friday's Back to the Father, do so. But wow, thank you so much, Dave. We appreciate you.
Thanks, Keith. I appreciate it. Good to be with you.
Likewise. And that is it for the first hour of Morning Joy, where truth matters. Now, we understand you might be on your way to work or getting into the office now. If that's the case and you aren't able to listen or watch Morning Joy, we've got you covered. You can always catch each segment, whether it's the next right thing, Thinking Out Loud, or the entire show, all accessible on YouTube. Also, if you're wanting to just listen, we also have the ability to give it to you via podcasting. So if you know Spotify, Apple Podcasts, you can certainly catch The Next Right Thing and Morning Joy. But if this is us parting ways, always got to say, God bless, make it a joyful day as much as you can. But if you're sticking with us after this short break, there's much more to come here on Morning Joy, where truth matters.
This has been Morning Joy, where truth matters, hosted by Keith Downey. Take some joy with you today. Visit grnonline.com/joy to listen again, share a segment, or answer the question of the day. That's grnonline.com/joy.